We're going to be looking at 5 verses today. Yeah, 5, you got it. Okay, 5 verses today. And these verses I have called without excuse. And the reason is because all 5 of these verses center on the idea that no human being has any excuse for not acknowledging God as who God is. Now, one of the things we've seen this week also, as we start in verse 18, it says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men." Let me stop there. Because this week, we have had an atrocious week in the world again. Remember last week we talked about in the first 9 days of July, there were 58 separate terror attacks in the world. This week, what do we got? We got a maniac, I say maniac, a dedicated Islamic terrorist driving through the streets of Nice in Paris, or in France rather, and killing, last I heard it was up to 84 dead and still a lot of people in critical condition. It's been another week like that. And what we saw was the wrath of a man, or the wrath of man in that. Last week, a couple weeks ago, we had Orlando, the wrath of man. In 1942, many of you may not have heard of this man, but there was a man named Reinhard Heydrich, who was probably one of the most evil men to ever live on the planet. He certainly was up in the running for it. Had Hitler died, he almost certainly would have taken over position as the new Chancellor of Germany had Hitler vacated the position. And in 1942, he was the governor of the country now, the Czech Republic. And he was an absolutely horrible person. As a matter of fact, he's probably the one who's responsible for the germination of the idea of the death camps. And Britain was so offended by this, they trained 2 Czech nationals, parachuted them in, and in May 1942, they assassinated Heydrich. It was a very botched assassination. They went with a machine gun. They stand there and the machine gun wouldn't go off. So then they threw a bomb. The bomb didn't really go where it wanted to, but enough of the shrapnel hit him that it put him in the hospital. And a week later, from the shrapnel, Heydrich ended up dying in the hospital. The point isn't to tell you about Heydrich. The point is to tell you what happened after Heydrich died. In the very near days after that, approximately 10,000 Czechs were rounded up. 5,000 of those were murdered at least. And there was a village called Lidice. And Lidice, not a big village, but hundreds of people at least. The Nazis went into that village and killed every male above the age of 14. And 58 or 50 some women also were killed in that village. And every woman and child that was left was sent to death camps and worked until they died. Some may have survived, but they went to these concentration camps with the idea of killing everyone. And they burned the town to the ground. And they made it so that if anyone went to Lidice, you wouldn't even know there was a town there, ever. The idea was to show their wrath so ferociously that no one would ever dream of attacking another Nazi official. Did Lidice do anything in particular? Nope. They just wanted to pick a town and show they could do it. They eliminated off the face of the earth an entire town. Now, when we think of wrath and think of God's wrath, how does that square, or man's wrath, how does that square with God's wrath? Because many people would say, wait a second, men are evil, they have wrath, they have anger. God's not angry, God's a loving God. He's a God that just, we all get around, sing kumbaya, and everything's cool with God. As a matter of fact, in the 2nd century, there was a heretic named Marcion. Marcion was so infuriated by these words when it says, "For the wrath of God is revealed," he actually removed the words "of God" and simply said, "The wrath is revealed." Marcion, not only that, was so offended by the idea of God's wrath, that he said, well, actually there were 2 gods. The Old Testament God, which was a lesser God, which was an evil God, a tyrant, who got in control for a while, and he was murdering people right and left. And then in the New Testament, the God of love and forgiveness took over, so that his God of wrath couldn't possibly be true, because after all, how could God be wrathful? Isn't that what humans do, not God? When we look at the source of the wrath in this verse, there is no question it says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all godliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness." The truth is, God is a God of wrath, and it is consistent fully with his character and his personality. Does that mean he's not a loving God? Certainly not. But what it means is, God is first and foremost a holy God. And consistent with holiness is righteousness and justice. And if God did not take out wrath on those who deserved wrath, He would be unholy and unjust. So therefore, God must take out His wrath on the unrighteous. And it's fully consistent with God. We don't have to worry about the idea of saying God can't be a God of wrath. Yes, God can be a God of wrath and still be a loving God that loves His children. He doesn't take out His wrath on His children, but He is a God of wrath. And to deny that is to deny who God is. Remember, it's the same God that sent Jesus Christ to save us that sent the flood to wipe out almost every living thing on the earth at the time of Noah. If we keep looking at this and look at who is to receive the wrath, one thing I think back on is, if you're old enough, as I am and some of you are, if you're old enough, you probably remember when every so often a girl was being murdered, and out usually in the West and then down in Florida, and they found out that a guy named Ted Bundy was going around murdering these women. Ted Bundy murdered at least 30 women that we know of and raped them, and not only that, in many cases, had sex with the women after they were dead. Ted Bundy was an absolute monster. And when I say 30 women, that's only those that are absolutely confirmed. It probably was at least 36 and may have been much more than that. Not even sure how many, at least if you ask me, how many people have you killed in your life? How many, or not killed, but how many have you murdered in your life? I think the number's 0. I can remember that really, really easy. With Bundy, they can't even tell you how many he killed. And I should say murder, because killing is different from murder. On January 24th, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed and put to death. In Chicago in the 1980s and 90s, a man named John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy killed and raped a minimum of 33 young men, buried them in his backyard. He used to dress up as a clown. People thought it was funny. Matter of fact, it's sick because there are people that still buy the paintings that he painted today, or try to buy the paintings. There's a big controversy over that. But Gacy murdered a minimum of 33 young men. They're not even sure how many. He couldn't tell them how many for sure. And on May 10th, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed and put to death. You see the common theme here: executed and put to death. Is there anyone that really doesn't believe that Bundy and Gacy didn't deserve this? There may be a few people against the death penalty who might try to argue against it, but the fact is, certainly Bundy and Gacy were without excuse. And when we talk about people who are without excuse, we can go to them, we can say, they were evil and they deserve to die and they deserve to be executed. The problem is, it's very easy to look at somebody like Bundy or Gacy and say, those are evil. Those deserve God's wrath. The fact is, it's much more difficult to say, wait a second, any sinner is deserving of God's wrath without Christ's righteousness being applied to their account. Because we are all without excuse. It talks here also about ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. I would argue it's impossible to have one without the other. Because if you're acting ungodly, that is unrighteous by its very nature. If you're acting unrighteously, that is an affront to God, who is a holy God. So therefore, these two go together. And then specifically in this case, it's talking about, as well, the wrath of God against those who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Kind of a weird phrase, and if I were to translate that literally from the Greek for you, it would be holding fast the truth in unrighteousness. Kind of a weird phrase. You talk about holding fast to the truth in righteousness, that makes sense. But holding fast to the truth in unrighteousness. What this is talking about, people who will deliberately twist and malign and suppress the truth. People who try to make right wrong and wrong into right. If you look at 2 Timothy 4, 3 and 4, it says, "For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but wanting to have their ears tickled, they will accumulate for themselves teachers in accordance with their own desires, and will turn away their ears from the truth and will turn aside to myths." The day has come already and arrived where people are looking to have their ears tickled. They don't want sound doctrine in general. I think we're an exception to that rule in this church. We decided right from the very beginning here we were going to teach the truth of the Bible no matter what that meant and no matter where it fell. We didn't look for someone to bring in to simply tickle our ears. But that's what we've got today. People who not only want to tickle the ears, but redefine the truth. I remember in 1972, I was 71, 72. Believe it or not, I was a weird kid. That goes without saying. But if you were here in Washington, D.C. in that time, you remember we had the Washington Post in the morning and the Washington Star and the Washington News in the evening. I don't remember in 71 or 2 if the News and Stars had combined yet or not, but we had multiple newspapers. And I would actually read the news for the day, which for a 10-year-old kid, 11-year-old kid was kind of weird. But that's the way I was. And I remember reading the news because they were having a hearing called Roe versus Wade in the Supreme Court. And I'd hear it every day and I'd say to myself, I wonder what this thing's really about. Because they can't be talking about what it sounds like they're talking about. How in the world would anybody debate whether you can kill a baby or not? Because later I realized that's exactly what they were talking about. The fact also is, at that point in time in that hearing, if you followed it in the Supreme Court, the key issue was it a living baby or not? If it wasn't alive, then you could do what you wanted. If it was alive, you couldn't do what you wanted. To get around that, the decision never even really addressed that. But if you thought about where the debate is going today, do you really hear people debating about whether the child is a living baby or not anymore? No. The debate today is about reproductive rights of women. Boy, that sounds lovely, especially compared to the phrase killing babies. The terms have been redefined to the fact of where people are holding to the truth in unrighteousness. They're using the unrighteousness for their own gain. Not only that, we talk about a woman's right to terminate a pregnancy. Terminate a pregnancy always results in the death of the baby. In addition to that, if you look at the style manual, see, newspapers have style manuals where reporters have to use certain words or they get in trouble. Many of the style manuals say that the pro-abortion side has to be called pro-choice and the pro-life side has to be called anti-abortion. If you think about the language, even the language is twisted just to make one pro and against. We are pro-life. We want babies to live. But it's being twisted and suppressed, and you see this every day. This is why Paul's starting to go through this stuff, is to say, hey, there is a problem with this line of thought. There's a problem with this reasoning. Not only that, if I were to say to you, let's take a person, for example, let's pick a person who, you ever heard of the term eugenics? Who was for eugenics? Eugenics means selective breeding. It's what Adolf Hitler did. The idea, what if we had a person who said, you know something, we should breed out the undesirable people. We should sterilize them. We should kill off their children. We should maybe even require a permit to have a child. Well, today we'd laugh at that. We go, you got to be kidding. Are you kidding me? And let's say this person furthermore went on to become a speaker at Ku Klux Klan rallies because they agreed with each other so much. And was invited to many more rallies because they agreed with each other so much. What do you think we would say about this person? Well, let me tell you what we said about this person. This person was named Margaret Sanger. And there is a bust of her, a statue of her, in the National Portrait Gallery in the Smithsonian Institute. She founded a group called Planned Parenthood, which was not founded to advance children, but which was founded specifically to get rid of minorities. It was founded specifically to sterilize and kill off minorities. And today, we can't even get it eliminated from the budget of the federal government. Truth has been twisted to the point where it's meaningless. Truth doesn't mean anything anymore. And that's what Paul's talking about here. The fact that we have totally perverted truth. And why? Because we've forgotten God. Because we're heading as a society on our own path to say, here's what's right in our eyes. Did you ever think about the fact that all morality is based on God? Everything is based on God. If there's no God, there's no reason for morality. We can't say there's an absolute right or wrong. Even simple things like zoning laws. Zoning laws are still based on someone's idea of fairness for what is right and wrong. Ultimately, all morality is based on God. Do away with God. Do away with God. Why not survival of the fittest? Why shouldn't I see someone and say, they got what I want, they're weaker than I want, I'll kill them and take it. There's nothing wrong with that if you eliminate God from the equation. That's what these people are doing. They're twisting right and wrong until they can completely eliminate God. Now, if we go on in these verses and start looking at verses 19 and 20, it says, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature has been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. There's that phrase, without excuse. Let's start in the beginning of this. It says that it is, in 19, because that which is known about God is evident within them. That word evident, made evident, is the Greek word phaneros, which means manifest, to make manifest. And it's closely related to another Greek word called phino. And phino is the Greek word that literally means to shine. Now, why does that go with make manifest? Because shining light on something makes it obvious what it is. When light is shined upon something, you can see, aha, I can work here, I can do that. You can see what it is. And that's what he's saying here, is that the knowledge of God is evident within each person because there is a shining on them of this knowledge. In addition to that, not only does each person know within, but they can look around and they can see why God is who he is. One thing we need to talk about here is something called natural revelation versus special revelation. And what Paul's talking about here is natural revelation. Special revelation is things like the Bible. God specifically said, here's my word, get to know it. Prophecy, when a prophet spoke, that was special revelation. The witness of the Holy Spirit in the world is special revelation in that it's God doing this. Natural revelation is things like creation. And therefore, when we look at creation, people can say, aha, wait a second, there's a creation, therefore there must be a God. We actually look at something called, in this I put it in the outline as the teleological argument. Big word, but don't worry about that. What that literally means is, if there is intelligent design, there must be a creator who designed that intelligently. Which makes sense. I mean, I didn't plan on using these as props, but here's my watches. If you saw me with this watch, which I have on backwards now, if you saw me with this watch, would you come up to me and say, nice watch, how did that evolve? Of course not. You ever go out? I've actually done this to evolutionists. Drives them nuts. If you want to drive an evolutionist nuts, do this. Go out and tell them, if they got a nice car, boy, I love your car, how'd that evolve? They look at you like, what are you talking about? It must just evolve. Did it take millions of years, or how'd you get that car? The fact is, looking at the car and looking at the watch, you can say, you know something? There had to be an intelligent design. There had to be an intelligence that knew to build this car and build this watch. Same thing with the earth. Forget the earth, look at yourself. The way we are made. A child could understand there's an intelligence that created us. A child could look at the earth and know there's an intelligence that created the earth and the universe. And what Paul's saying here is there's an inner knowledge inside of each person that says, even if you know nothing about God, there is a God. That's why he say that it's evident within them, because every person already can see there is, or should be able to see there is a God. And the design that we see is the design that says that it's evident to them that there is a God who created. If you look at verse 20, it says, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen. How have they been seen? Through creation. Look at creation. Creation requires omnipotence. Creation requires omniscience. If you look at the house you're in, whatever house that is, okay? You'd never think of the house evolving. Instead, you say to yourself, you know something, to build this house took people with a specific skill set. It probably took carpenters. It probably took electricians. It probably took plumbers. It took all these people with specialized knowledge, and they came together and they built a house. The fact is, we can look at the planet and we can see the same thing. It took specialized knowledge. for this planet to be created. It took specialized knowledge for us to be created in the universe. That specialized knowledge is the omniscience or all-knowing of God. And it took specialized power, the omnipotence of God. He had to be all-powerful to create this. And we can see that through the design. We can see that someone had to have the design and the skill set to do this. When it says about his eternal power, that is one of his attributes that it took to create. When it says his divine nature, it's saying he is God, and only God could do this. So what Paul's saying in this very simply is, hey, you should be able to look around you and say there is a God. We can understand what things are by how they are made. My dad was a cartoonist, a wonderful cartoonist. And he used to do magazine covers. He used to do a number of things like that. He had his books he put out. You could look at his magazine covers in particular, wonderful colored pen and ink drawings that were just phenomenal cartoons. And you could look at them and you could say, you know something? There had to be an intelligence that created this. There had to be a skill set that created this. Just like my dad's cartoons. We can see the skill set and the intelligence and the power of God in the creation of the earth. Now when we look at verse 20 again with this, how this is clearly seen, being understood, then we can tie that right back to verse 18 with the wrath. Why are people under wrath? Because every person on the planet should be able to look and say, a God created this planet and I need to know that God. No exceptions. Everyone is under God's wrath because of that. Because even natural revelation can show us God exists. Now, one thing that's been a debate for quite a while is, can natural revelation save a person? Can a person be saved simply by knowing that there is a God? I would say no, clearly. That's called universalism, believing that everyone can be saved without knowing Jesus Christ. Natural revelation is sufficient to show that God exists and that it shows the need. It shows the need for a Savior. But natural revelation alone is not enough to save. The reason is because every person on earth is responsible for sinning. Every one of us has a sin nature. Now the only exception, and we'll talk about that in about a month or two, is children who die before an age of accountability. That's a separate story, and we'll show in Romans how that is actually a biblical concept, not just something we made up. Now when we talk about all this, one of the things we've got to talk about is the fact of, okay, people should be able to see that there's a God. But I've watched the news. I've watched the TV, I've watched the newspapers. Haven't they already disproven the existence of God? I've seen enough specials. All you got to do is watch the Discovery Channel for a little while or something. You can tell there ain't no God. It's obvious. Haven't they disproven that? A few years ago, it was in Massachusetts, I believe. I think it's the Boston area, but I forget where exactly. Someone decided to do an MRI on a patient. And they took the patient and put him in the MRI machine. And what they found was that if they would put images in front of this person of different people, that the patient would respond. You can see the different areas of the brain light up, that they were responding to determine the emotion of the pictures they were looking at. Now that's all fascinating, but there was one little problem. The patient was a dead salmon the guy got at a fish market. And the salmon was responding to the images. What they found out is for 15 years at least there's been a bug in MRIs. And if nothing is there, it takes the background noise and creates something out of it. So this dead salmon, they were laughing about it at first, but it was like on and on. Every time they showed the salmon a picture, there it was. The brain would react to it. It was a dead salmon. That's the science that's disproven God. Now, I'm not against science, don't get me wrong. Science is valuable, but we have to remember science is not infallible. One of these interesting also, they found that if you look at studies that are done, did you know that in the area of psychology and the humanities, that a minimum of 65% of all studies, when they started studying the studies, could not be reproduced? You get different results. It didn't work. There's a number of reasons for this. If you don't understand confirmational bias and a number of other points, I'm not going to go into that, but the point is, studies are not accurate. And then they said, you know something, let's study the studies. Let's go to physics, because you really can't mess around with physics. You know, you got a proton, neutron, whatever, okay? Actually, I should tell you the joke. Neutron walks into a bar and says, how much for a drink? Bartender says, for you, no charge. If you understand science, it was cute. I know, it's terrible. Point is that physics is an area in science where there's very little debate, you'd think. You know what they found in physics? 30% of the studies in physics couldn't be reproduced. In physics. There is no more hard science than physics. What they found on average is in every field of science, a minimum of 50% of the studies couldn't be reproduced. What this means is that what we take as science is often garbage. It's the reason why it's not hard to prove evolution with Darwinism using science. Because they make false assumptions, they have confirmational bias, they do a number of other things in the studies, and they're wrong. I have no problem saying, do I believe in God or do I believe in something that appears to contradict God? I believe in God. And normally when we dig deeper, you know what we find? It never contradicted God in the first place. It was either a bad study or something was done and you find a bad basis for it, and it just wasn't true in the first place. If we look at all this, what Paul is saying in these verses, back to these verses, is that people are without excuse. There is no excuse for not believing in God. Now, if we continue in 20 and 21, it says, for even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Because they knew God. How did they know God? For one thing, through natural revelation. That's what we've been talking about here. They knew there was a God because they could see the evidence of God. Each one of us has that responsibility. I would also say there's something else here, is that originally the gospel was given to every family on the planet in multiple times. Number one, Adam and Eve had it. May not have passed it down. Noah and his family, his entire family knew the gospel. Not only that, if you look at the time in the book of Acts, it appears, and we found this even historically finding things, that the gospel probably did literally go to every person in the world at that point in time. That doesn't mean everybody has it now. What it means is people, through their own inaction, didn't pass the gospel down. That's not God's fault. But certainly, even if they didn't have the gospel, they should be able to look around and say, I know there's a God. And then it's up to God for how to get the information to them. But what happened instead? What happened is they did not honor God as God. It says so right here in 21. What does that mean? They built idols. Even if you look at the Israelites, the chosen people of God, they get the Red Sea parts, they have the 10 plagues, they have everything else happening. They're going through the desert. Moses goes up to the Mount Sinai to get the 10 Commandments. He's up there a little bit too long, comes down. Aaron's built a golden calf to worship. And they're all bowing down, praising the calf made of gold for getting him out of Egypt. Why? I can tell you why. And it's obvious to anyone who studies human nature. Because if we eliminate God from the equation, we not only have no morality, but we have no restraints. If God is simply a chunk of gold, or God is simply sitting afar off, just singing kumbaya, and anything you do is fine with God, or there is no God, then you can do anything you want and there's no consequences. That's why people want to eliminate God. It's very simple. No God, no consequences. And it also says in verse 21, not only did they not honor God or give thanks. We owe God thanksgiving for the planet He created and for our own creation. That is natural and what we should be doing. I mean, think about it. If someone were to invite you to a fancy dinner, I'll give you an example myself. I was invited to a presidential dinner one time and I went to it with Ronald Reagan. And again, I say I had dinner with Ronald Reagan, true, but there's about 500 other people there with me. When I went to this dinner, somebody paid for that ticket. It was an expensive ticket. You know what I did before I ate the dinner? I said to that person, thanks! You paid for me to go there. If you invited somebody to your house and made a fancy dinner for them, not that it'd be required, but the person, if they had any kind of common sense at all, they would say, thank you. It's normal. What do we do here? God created the planet. He created everything that we use to eat. He created ourselves. He created everything in the world. And we don't even bother to say thanks. I don't mean us personally, but people don't even bother to say thanks. Not only that, when I go into a restaurant, I don't make a show of it, but Lynn and I will pray before a meal, or if I'm by myself, I'll pray before a meal. Not a big show, but praying and honoring God. And I've occasionally had people say, hey, why do you do that? My question would be, why doesn't everybody else? God created it. Why wouldn't I give him thanks before I eat what he created? Matter of fact, sometimes I've even gone to thank the chef as well, because the chef prepared it. The fact is, it should be natural to give thanks to God, but it's not. Because man, in the Gentile way of expressing their own way to do things, has said, forget it. I want no God to restrain me. I want no God to give thanks to. I'm going to do it my way. This is why Paul's saying they are under the wrath of God and they have no excuse. None whatsoever. If we look on 21 further, it says, but they became futile in their speculations and their foolish heart was darkened. Interesting verse here about their foolish heart being darkened and their futile speculations. One of the things I reflect back on is the idea of the Pharaoh when his heart was hardened, similar to the darkening of the heart here. And one thing people have always said is, wasn't it God's fault for darkening his heart? What we find, if you look at the Hebrew, is there were 3 different Hebrew words used for hardened in that case. And that when it started, the word that was being used was actually a word that meant God was taking his hands off and allowing Pharaoh to harden his own heart. Same thing happening to people today. God doesn't have to deceive the people. They're hardening their own heart. They're going in their own way. It's natural. If you look at a thing, even something as simple as evolution. Evolution, have you ever thought about the fact that evolution is the basis for all the other major falsehoods that we deal with today? Abortion, homosexual rights, all the gay marriage, all the other things we talk about here. They all can be rooted back to abortion. Why? Because if we are created by God in his image, how dare we kill a baby? How dare we say that God was wrong in Genesis 3, that marriage was for a man or a woman? The first thing you had to do was get evolution in place, and if evolution is true, sure, whatever. Anything goes. Not only that, you want to kill something for convenience? Survival of the fittest, no big deal. What's the big deal with killing a baby if it's... Again, babies are, let's face it, they're inconvenient. It's not a problem in evolution. It's only a problem if you acknowledge God and God's existence. Verse 22 is a verse that I have said to myself so many times when I've dealt with people at times. Not to them, usually to their face, but to myself, where it says, professing to be wise, they became fools. I spent my first 2 years of college at Johns Hopkins. And I got to tell you, it was a heartbreaking place. Because they didn't even know it, but it was riddled with hopelessness. And I don't mean there weren't any believers there. But almost everyone at Hopkins thought they were the most brilliant thing walking on the planet. That was just normal for a Hopkins student. And the professors were a lot worse. Not only, I still remember one guy who would go out on the steps of the dorms and just start pontificating, just like a Greek philosopher would or something, and go on for hours doing this. Okay, not like me, but anyway, would just start pontificating. That was just to show his brilliance in his mind. It was complete hopelessness. I could see it in the people. I didn't want to say to them, look, professing to become wise. But it was true. They thought they were the smartest people in the world, yet they didn't know the simplest things like God exists. Sometimes the smartest people say the dumbest things even a child could see the truth of. This week we had the radical terror attack in France. Guy got into a car because of his Islamic beliefs and mowed down people on the sidewalks. Hit several hundred, killed at least 84 so far. You know what some of the headlines were this week? Truck runs over people. Truck does this, truck does that. New York Times, CNN, CBC, all of them. They blamed the truck. Do you really think that the truck suddenly decided, I'm going to kill some people? Put my transmission in gear, I'm going for it. No, it was a human being that killed them for his radical ideology, and even a child could see that. Yet they're debating Well, what? Do we know if he was tied in directly to ISIS and got money for them? Maybe it was the No, it wasn't. A child can understand this. Yet, seeking to be wise, they become fools. They can't see what's right there in front of their face. The Fort Hood massacre a few years back. The guy shooting people and screaming, Allahu Akbar. I gotta say, that says to me it probably is related to Islam. A lot of people said no, that was workplace violence according to the administration. That's all it was. Man, it is so simple and it's right there in front of us. But ideology obscures the facts, and that's what we see over and over and over again, is people's ideology changes the facts. The facts should be the truth, and then you get your ideology from that, not the other way around. Now, we've looked at the verses some. Let's talk a little bit about a few applications from this. Number one, we need to speak the truth to people. And that truth is God is a God of wrath. Am I suggesting that we walk up to people on the streets and say, you're going to hell? No. I've met too many people like that, and it really doesn't lead anyone to Christ. At least not that I've ever seen, okay? But we don't obscure the fact of the truth also. I'm not saying you lead with that, but if someone wants to know what are the options for eternity, heaven or hell, that's it. And that everyone who is not a child of God is under God's wrath. Those are factual statements that we shouldn't be backing away from. Because right now, when we do that, we're seen as politically incorrect, divisive, and having hate speech. I don't hate the people. I feel terrible for them. But the fact is, we can't shade the truth because it doesn't fit our society today. The other thing I've heard before is, how would God send, if God's a loving God, how would He send people to hell? We've all heard that one. Well, because He's also a holy God. But in addition to that, I've heard people try to explain it by saying, well, sending people to hell actually is a loving act because that way it makes it a better heaven for everyone else. No! Sending people to hell is an act of a wrathful God who's acting holy, just, and righteous. That's the truth. Nothing wrong with saying that. Nothing wrong with speaking. We need to be the people who are not looking at as suppressing the truth and unrighteousness. We need to be the people that people look at and say, that person is telling the truth. That person is telling what, no matter where the chips fall. It's up to God whether they get saved or not. It's up to us to broadcast the message to people. The next thing we should take away from this chapter here is, God is just. Everyone deserves hell. Everyone. It's only Christ's righteousness that saves people when it's applied to their accounts. So is God being unjust when He sends someone to hell? Of course not. God is a just God who lets people go to hell of their own choice, of their own volition. That's redundant, I suppose, but who of their own choice go to hell. That's why God's just. We don't need to back away from that. He is a holy God. Not only that, the other thing we can take away from this as an application is most people instinctively know that God exists. Paul was talking about this. They already knew it within them. You know why that's important? It's important because you may not realize it, but there's a lot of people out there who really want to know the truth about God who are waiting for someone like you to tell them. I've been amazed how many times I started talking and somebody else comes over and says, can I hear about that? I've always wondered about that. In restaurants, in parks, wherever. I don't go to parks that much anymore, but the fact is in restaurants it happens a lot. But the fact is people have an intrinsic knowledge that there is a God and that they want to know about that God, even if they deny it. And that will open doors for us. That's also the reason there's so many false religions and cults in this world. Because each one is trying to find a way to God that accommodates what their own view of life is. Not only that, again, remember you create your own religion, no consequences. Make yourself God, make a golden calf God, make whatever. The fact is they want to do it their way. But that's why there are so many of these. Why don't they just ignore God completely? The reason? Because instinctively there's something in us that says there is a God. Something we can see, something we may deny it, but it's there in every person, deep in their conscience. The next thing that I want to look at here is the fact that we can see from this that worldly wisdom leads to ruin. Remember, chapter 1 in Romans, as we go through this portion of it, is talking about the Gentile philosophy of how to live your life. Chapter 2 is going to be the Jewish philosophy without Christ. Chapter 3 is going to be for everyone. The fact is, in this Gentile philosophy, what we can see is there is worldly wisdom that leads to ruin. Worldly wisdom leads to hell. Now, I am not against wisdom, and I'm not against knowledge. People that know me know that I study everything I can get my hands on just about. I mean, sometimes people ask me about topics and it's like, there's no way you're going to know anything. Yeah, why not? Well, because I saw a book on it, or I saw an article on it, and I read it. I love learning. It's just the way I am. So I'm not against knowledge, and I'm not against wisdom. What I'm saying is, if you ignore God and ignore the facts, and you try to use worldly wisdom, what you're going to find is it's going to lead to ruin. And not only that, in most cases, even on earth, in most cases, it's going to lead to mistrust. It's going to lead to unhappiness. It's going to lead to a lot of things you don't want in your life. The fact is if we look at this, when we see that everyone is under the wrath of God without Jesus Christ, and we see that no one has any excuse, it means we need to be the ones out there telling people that Jesus is real and that God is real. It means that it's up to God to decide who responds. Now I'll say something else, whether it's to somebody here or somebody who's going to watch this on the web. If you do not know Jesus Christ, you are under the wrath of God and you have no excuse. And ultimately that leads to hell. I'm hoping that everyone here is already saved, but I don't know. And I'm guessing that if we have all the people that watch this someday on the internet, probably some unsaved person is going to watch this. The only way is to turn to Jesus Christ and to say, I'm not trusting in my own works. I'm putting my faith in Christ, that His blood alone saved me. And that His righteousness is applied to my account. And that I'm not relying on my own works or my own righteousness. That's what salvation is about. Because of this passage, that's what we need to be telling people about. And hopefully if there's anyone here that doesn't know that, come talk to us. It's easy to meet Christ. And on the web, phone the church, email us, whatever. Read your Bible. Believe in Jesus Christ as your only way to salvation and you will be saved. Let's go ahead and pray.